All right. So my name is Apaar Tuli. I'm the head of design at Whim. It's a service launched by a Finnish startup called MaaS Global. We've already been active for a couple of years. My background's in design, but I've also studied architecture and urban planning. So the presentation I'm going to give talks a bit about all of these. So before we get into the future of mobility, I think it's good to start with the past and the problem, because it's very easy to jump to solutions without actually understanding the problem. So the past teaches us a lot about change. What we've taken for granted hasn't always been so. Like our city streets. This is Manhattan, a bit over 100 years ago. And our city streets weren't actually designed for transportation. That wasn't the primary purpose of a road in a city. Our cities and the streets were more like parks. They were places where people would meet, where vendors would sell, where kids would play, where social interaction used to happen. This is also Manhattan, just over 100 years ago. Now, back in these days, there was an interesting profession. It doesn't exist anymore. It was called the crossing sweepers. Now, crossing sweepers were these young boys generally, whose job was to clean the street in front of wealthy people who were trying to cross the street. In return for doing that, they used to get some money, and that's how they used to make a living. Now, what was it that these crossing sweepers were trying to clean on the street? What is it that these rich people were willing to pay them for? Any guesses? Horse shit, good. Horse shit, that's exactly what was going on. Our cities and pavements were full of horse shit. In fact, in any big city like New York or London, there would be about 100,000 horses moving about, each of them producing about 15 kilos of horse manure and 1 liter of urine. All of that was deposited on the streets. At the end of the day, some of them also ended up dead. They were also left on the sides of the street. So not a very pretty picture, of course. In fact, the situation became so bad that in 1894, an article was published in the Times, and they said that by 1950, every street in London will be buried under 3 meters of horse manure. This was termed as the Great Horse Manure Crisis, because it did seem really, really scary. 3 meters of horse manure on every street. They didn't know what to do about it. An urban planning conference was held at the end of the century, and urban planners from different parts of the world came. And the story goes that the conference was supposed to last for 10 days, but it only ended after 3 because nobody knew what the solution could be, how to deal with this problem. But of course, the problem went away. We know that in 1950, things weren't so bad. What happened? Did this product solve the problem? Now, it's not that the car was invented specifically to deal with the Great Horse Manure Crisis, but the technology that a car offered made horses largely non-essential, which led to the problem disappearing by itself. And what's there not to like about this? It runs at 20 miles an hour, it's odorless, doesn't vibrate, it runs on something called hydrocarbons. It all sounds amazing. And 100 years ago, this seemed like the perfect solution to all our problems back then. And our streets started to change. Pedestrians and automobiles started competing for the same space. People weren't used to the idea of having automobiles, machines running on the road. And here you can see how people and traffic are just intermingling in New York, something you won't see anymore. And as they say, the rest is history. Now, the automobile brought the freedom of mobility to millions of us. It made traveling so much easier. It gave us access to distances we couldn't ever imagine. But every time I look at pictures like these of car advertisements, I wonder, does our morning commute ever look like this? Because for most of us, this is what a morning commute or commute in a big city looks like. This is also a beautiful curvy road like the previous picture. Now, I think what a systems thinker would say that what we thought was a solution actually ended up becoming a problem because we didn't quite imagine the whole system and how it would scale. But words and pictures don't quite describe this. I think this sketch describes this to me better. We are living at the edges of these deep metaphorical canyons that we have created for ourselves. This is what a city street is like for most of us. 80% of the city street has been dedicated to automobile and its related infrastructure. Every year, about 1.2 million people die in traffic-related accidents. Most of these people are generally kids or old people, people with disabilities, or people who are distracted. Think about that number. Every 30 seconds, one person is falling into this metaphorical canyon that we've created for ourselves. So, of course, as a design solution, we haven't done such a good job. And how did we end up in this? Now, to understand that, I like to look at artifacts. Artifacts which have helped us move over the ages. We started with this. It gave us access to distances that the human body could handle. And the shoe was soon augmented by this. This is a buggy whip. And a buggy whip was used as the primary way to control mobility for almost 2 centuries. You control a horse with a buggy whip, it moves, it stops, it turns, depending on how you hit the horse with it. It extended our economic range quite dramatically. Our cities became bigger and bigger because of the horse and the distances we could cover with it. But nothing changed our societies like this object. And it's not so much about what the object is, but it's about what it represents. And that is the system of ownership. Anybody who owns a car key owns a car. And by having access to this car, they can move about. Everybody else who wants to move about needs to do the same thing. And this is what it looks like. In pictures, this is what it looks like. And I think it's fair to say that during this 1 century, we are now dealing with yet another horse manure crisis. And unfortunately, we can't solve this one using cars again, because the problem that's being created by cars can't be solved by adding more cars to the system. Not even the fancy electric and self-driving cars that everybody is so eagerly waiting for. I think it's important to look at cars as part of a larger system rather than individual products. I think Eliel Saarinen had a really nice saying on this when he talks about designing in the next larger context. When you design a chair in the context of a room, you design the room in context of a house, you design the house in context of an environment, and so on. We have to think of the car as how it contributes to the larger transportation network. How does it play with the other modes of transport? How does it make living in cities a better experience for everyone, not just for those who are inside the car? Because if we don't do that, the future doesn't look so bright. In 2050, a lot of research has been done about what the situation will be like. A couple of scenarios have been studied. The business as usual scenario in 2050, when like 66% of the population will be living in an urban environment, looks like this. We'll have twice as many the number of cars and a lot of pollution. And I think we understand this. It's the natural outcome of growing population. However, if we switch to the electric and autonomous future with self-driving cars, everybody owning their own little car, cars coming and picking up your kids while you're waiting at home or you're in some other part of town, that looks like this. Even though we do manage to reduce the pollution a lot, the congestion doesn't go away at all. And that's not a sustainable future. It's just not possible for cities to grow at this pace. But a third scenario has also been looked at, and that is the shared and multimodal scenario, where not only do we reduce the amount of pollution, but we also cut down on the congestion. And cities really want that to happen. because cities have dealt with this problem and they understand it pretty well. This is the amount of space it takes on a street to move a fixed number of people. And I think it's quite evident that certain modes of transport are more efficient in an urban setting compared to some other modes of transport when it comes to moving people. And like we just heard, a car is rather inefficient as a product. It's the second largest expense in a family after housing, and it takes the majority of the budget when it comes to mobility. Yet, it's used barely 5% of its lifetime, between 4 and 6% generally. It's used by 1.2 passengers in Europe. It's used 30 to 50 minutes a day at the most. And yet, it takes so much raw material and so much energy to build a car, to maintain a car, and to get rid of it. And I feel that as designers and engineers, there's something that could be done to improve upon this situation, because this is not a sustainable way of living. There are examples. Mexico City had to set an upper limit on the amount of parking they could actually create with every new construction, because parking started competing with housing. People couldn't afford housing because parking was making real estate more and more expensive. That meant the poorer you were, the further out of the city you had to live in order to just be able to work in the city. And that led to more traffic coming into the city, causing more poverty in the city, and making the life even harder for most people. Or cities like Delhi and Beijing, who've had massive pollution problems over the last decade as the economies are growing. A couple of years ago in Delhi, the pollution got so bad that the government had to start a system of odd and even number plates. So only people with odd number plates could drive on certain days, and on some other days, people with even number plates. Now, what this led to was that the rich people ended up buying 2 cars so they could drive on every day, and the poor people didn't get any benefit out of that anyway, and the city didn't get any better either. So not very promising. But what happens next then? If this is what has taken and brought us to the 21st century, what comes next? It's actually another simple object. This is a skeleton key, and a skeleton key was used in earlier centuries as a master key, this one key which can unlock a variety of different doors. And that's how we think of mobility as a service and what we are doing. Mobility as a service is that magic key to my city, which lets me have access not just to the mode of transport that I own, but any other mode of transport that exists in my city. Because it's not about the transportation itself, it's about being user-centered, getting people from one place to another. People are not interested in that particular bus or that particular cycle or that particular car. People want to get their job done. And that's what we did. We brought this key to its 21st century equivalent. We launched Whim in Helsinki in autumn of 2017. And we connected all the different modes of transport that the city had to offer into that one magic skeleton key. And with that, by paying for a monthly subscription fee, you are able to access all these different modes and get from one place to another. You can think of it like Netflix of transportation. That's what we've often been called. But binge traveling is not what we want to do. We want to make travel more efficient and cheaper rather than the other way around. Now, MaaS has a few concepts which are worth looking at. MaaS is about intermodality, or the idea that not every journey has to be done with just one mode of transport. Every trip can be done using the mode that is most sensible, and every trip can also be done by connecting modes of transport. MaaS is also about modal shift, moving people to sustainable methods of transport in a city. And MaaS is about using active modes such as walking and cycling. Now, cycling is not just a hobby that people do on their weekends. Cycling is a legitimate way to move about in a city, and cities need to treat it as such. And by doing all of this, we can achieve larger goals that cities might have, goals related to public policy, sustainability, carbon emissions, equality, affordability. And these are all the things which people in a city need. Now, Whim, the service we launched, looks just like any other route planner, but there's a difference. You can actually perform the whole trip because you're subscribed to the service. Tickets are issued automatically, and you can use that to get from one place to another. And of course, we are multimodal. So if you need a taxi or a car or a city bike, then Whim lets you do that as it's part of your subscription. But of course, it's not about the modes of transport. We want to focus on a service that is tailored to a person's unique mobility needs. And from the user research we did, that was one of the findings. People's mobility needs are so different from at different parts of the day, at different parts of the week, different parts of the year, and during their lifetime. We all have different mobility needs. So what we want to do is enable a service level guarantee so people can buy into the right package that suits their needs at that time of their life. How do you do that? How do you move away from the idea of transportation and design for mobility? One of the tools that we have used is the language of mobility. By looking at how people interact with all the different mobility infrastructure around them, we are able to understand from a user's perspective what mobility means. And this translates into this vast vocabulary of mobility, the things that we do to get from one place to another. We use these, connecting them together into intermodal journeys. By knowing how people do a certain trip using a certain mode, from an end user perspective, not from the perspective of the mode of transport, we can understand how to build a better end-to-end experience that people would be willing to try out as a compelling alternative to owning a car. That is our mission, how to create something that is a compelling alternative to car ownership. But it's also good to remember that technology and design and engineering aren't always the solution to every problem. Because a city inherently is not a technology problem, but a spatial problem. A city is a political problem. It's a social problem. And all of these need to be tackled for services like these to actually work. We can take an example of these two journeys. Now, if we were to design a journey which is door-to-door using your personal car versus a journey which actually requires you to walk a bit on either end and maybe even share it with somebody else, which of these would be the right journey to design? How should we nudge users through a great user experience, through a great service offering? How do we nudge people in the right direction? Now, the right answer to this is it depends what your needs are to which of these journeys should you be taking. But if we design our cities and services that operate those cities for only one of these journeys, let's say the one on top, the future doesn't look good. It looks something like this. And this is not a future that I would like to either live in or design for. We have to match the needs of individuals versus the larger needs of the society. Because a city that only helps to serve a few people doesn't serve anyone at all. Cities don't work like that. Therefore, it's important for a city to be able to support any and all of these types of journeys at any given time. And this leads to that whole idea of multimodality. A multimodal street is just a lot more efficient compared to a street that's been designed purely for one mode of transport. In fact, it's almost 3 times as efficient. And that's why the European Commission declared 2018 as the year of multimodality, because this is where the future of cities lie. This is a snapshot of data from Whim. We've completed almost 3 million trips over the last year and a half. This is Helsinki area. And as you can see that the city has a life of its own. It has this breathing pattern. It wakes up and goes to sleep day after day. Weekdays are different from weekends. Mornings are different from evenings. And you can see how a city has its own personality. Now, we have to design cities as these conduits of transport, because those conduits are the ones which carry goods and information and knowledge and ideas. If we clog these arteries of the city, we end up congesting and basically suffocating the city, leading to its early death. That's not what we want. We want cities to be vibrant places. So I think that people working in design and technology need to think of ourselves as the crossing sweepers of the 21st century. We are the people who need to clear up those paths so others would like to walk down those paths and make it easier for everyone else to live in the city. I'll leave you with this final thought from the former mayor of Bogota. Thank you for listening. Thank you.